a reminder that evil does not always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it leaves only the faintest impression of a fingertip pressed against a door, waiting patiently for a future that knows how to read it. The arrest warrant was signed on a gray afternoon that felt eerily similar to the morning Carol Whitman vanished, as if the sky itself remembered 1975 and refused to brighten for what came next. Illinois 1975 cold case solved became more than a headline. It became a reckoning. When deputies from 2 states approached Thomas Renshaw's modest brick house, neighbors peeked through curtains, unaware that they were watching the final act of a story that had begun 33 years earlier in a kitchen filled with unfinished coffee and unanswered questions. Renshaw did not resist. He opened the door slowly, eyes scanning the badges, the documents, the certainty in their posture. The forgotten fingerprint that had once seemed like a ghost in a filing cabinet had transformed into a weapon of truth. Community shock surged again, sharper this time, because the suspect had never been a shadowy stranger passing through town but a man who had borrowed sugar, who had nodded at block parties, who had stood quietly in church pews while Carol's name was whispered in prayer. As news broke, Millfield streets buzzed with disbelief. Elderly residents who had lived through the original investigation felt as though time had collapsed, pulling them backward into a moment they had tried to bury. Younger generations, raised on the legend of the mysterious disappearance, now confronted the unsettling reality that the monster had been real and close. Prosecutors laid out the evidence carefully, aware that decades-old cases are fragile, vulnerable to doubt, and fading memory. The fingerprint placed Renshaw inside Carol's house on the night she vanished. His shifting alibis revealed cracks in the narrative he had maintained since 1975. Financial records showed he had abruptly terminated his lease in Millfield just weeks after the disappearance, relocating without forwarding details. Witnesses recalled his nervous demeanor during the initial questioning, details that had once seemed like anxiety now reframed as something darker. Yet the absence of a body remained the defense's strongest shield. Without physical remains, without a confession, the prosecution would have to convince a jury that silence and a single mark on a door could speak louder than decades of denial. The trial began in a packed courtroom where every seat carried history. Reporters from regional outlets filled the back rows, their notebooks poised as if capturing a living time capsule. The narrative unfolded with relentless precision. Detectives from the original investigation described the scene in Carol's home, the untouched purse, the code on the hook, the radio murmuring static into an empty room. Forensic experts explained how fingerprint technology had evolved, how the smudged partial print preserved in 1975 could now be enhanced and matched with near certainty. They walked jurors through the science, transforming what once seemed like a fragile relic into a pillar of evidence. Delgado testified about reopening the file, about the moment the database returned a name, about confronting Renshaw and watching composure dissolve. The defense countered with a passage of time, arguing that memories degrade, that assumptions fill gaps, that a fingerprint proves presence, but not violence. They suggested Carol may have known Renshaw casually, that he could have entered the house earlier for an innocent reason. But prosecutors pressed harder, highlighting inconsistencies in his statements, his inability to explain why he had denied ever being inside the Whitman home. They revealed testimony from a former coworker in Missouri who recalled Renshaw making a cryptic remark in the late 1980s about leaving Illinois because of trouble with a woman. The courtroom grew still as that detail settled like dust. Outside, Millfield held its breath. The term cold case no longer felt abstract. It was personal, immediate, raw. For Carol's surviving relatives, cousins who had grown up under the shadow of her disappearance, the proceedings reopened wounds they had inherited rather than experienced. They listened as her final hours were reconstructed, as timelines were tightened, as the quiet street on Maple was described in painstaking detail. Each word carried weight. Renshaw sat rigid, his hair silvered by age, his face betraying little. Observers searched for remorse, for flickers of guilt, for anything human beneath the layers of denial. Days stretched into weeks. The jury deliberated under the gravity of history, aware that their decision would echo backward through decades. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words landed with a force that seemed to reverberate beyond the walls. Community shock gave way to a complex wave of relief, sorrow, and anger. Some wept quietly. Others stared ahead, processing the finality. For the first time since 1975, Carol Whitman's name was attached not only to mystery but to accountability. Sentencing followed, a formal acknowledgement that time does not erase responsibility. The judge spoke of patience, of persistence, of how justice can move slowly, yet still arrive. Renshaw received life imprisonment, a symbolic weight for a crime committed in youth and answered in old age. Yet, even as headlines proclaimed Illinois 1975 cold case solved, forgotten fingerprint shocks small town, the resolution felt incomplete. Carol's body had never been recovered. The precise details of that night remained locked inside the convicted man's silence. Investigators continued searching properties linked to Renshaw's past, combing through overgrown land and abandoned structures, hoping for remains that would grant physical closure. None were found. Millfield organized a memorial service in the town square, not because they had forgotten, but because they finally had permission to grieve openly without the burden of uncertainty. Photographs of Carol as a young teacher, smiling beneath autumn leaves, were displayed beside candles that flickered in the evening air. Speakers recalled her kindness, her laugh, the way she believed in her students. The narrative shifted from fear to remembrance. Yet beneath the surface lingered an unsettling truth. For 33 years, the answer had existed in a filing cabinet, waiting for technology and determination to intersect. The forgotten fingerprint became a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest fragment can carry the weight of truth. Law enforcement agencies across the region revisited their own cold cases with renewed urgency, re-examining evidence once deemed insufficient. Millfield's story sparked a broader conversation about patience and justice, about the families who endured decades of ambiguity. In quiet conversations at kitchen tables, residents admitted they had once suspected Renshaw but dismissed the thought as paranoia. The realization that instinct had brushed against truth left a residue of regret. Children who had grown up hearing about the mysterious disappearance now told their own children about the power of persistence, about how science can illuminate what darkness tries to conceal. The Whitman house, long stripped of its history, gained a new context. It was no longer merely the site of a vanishing, it was the place where evidence had endured. On the anniversary of the conviction, Delgado visited Carol's parents' graves, placing a single white flower between their headstones. He stood quietly, aware that they had died without answers, yet perhaps comforted by the idea that somewhere, in ways unseen, they might know that the truth had surfaced. The case that once defined Millfield as a town haunted by absence now defined it as a community that refused to forget. And still, even with a verdict delivered and a sentence imposed, the story carried a haunting undertone. Justice had arrived, but it had taken decades. It had required faith in a fragment of skin left on a door. It had demanded that a small town confront the possibility that evil can wear a familiar face for years without detection. As night settles over Maple Street, the porch lights glow softly, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet beneath that calm lies the memory of a young woman whose life was interrupted, whose name became synonymous with mystery and then with resolution. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved is more than a headline. It is a testament to time's dual nature, how it can conceal and reveal, how it can harden grief and then soften it with answers. And in the stillness, when the wind brushes against quiet houses, the town remembers that sometimes justice does not thunder in dramatically but arrives in the faint impression of a fingerprint, preserved against all odds, waiting patiently to speak. Years after the conviction, when the television vans had long since disappeared and the courtroom benches returned to routine disputes over traffic violations and property lines, Millfield discovered that closure is not a single moment, but a slow, uneven process that settles into the cracks of daily life. Illinois 1975 cold case solved had once dominated front pages, but now it lived in subtler spaces, in the way neighbors paused when passing the old Whitman house, in the cautious pride with which the sheriff's department referenced the case during training sessions, in the quiet understanding that justice, however delayed, had found its mark. Yet beneath the relief lingered an ache that no verdict could erase. Carol Whitman remained absent, her resting place unknown, her final moments reconstructed only through inference and evidence. The town had answers, but not all of them. Detectives continued to press Thomas Renshaw for information about where he had taken her, hoping that time and age might loosen the grip of silence. Prison interviews were conducted with measured patience, investigators presenting photographs, maps, and fragments of testimony as if assembling a mosaic in front of him. Renshaw listened, sometimes impassive, sometimes visibly agitated, but he never confessed, never offered the detail that would lead to a gravesite and a marker bearing her name. For Carol's extended family, the absence of remains was a wound that refused to close. They organized annual remembrance walks through Millfield's Central Park, transforming grief into ritual, carrying candles and photographs beneath trees that had grown tall since 1975. Younger residents joined, not out of obligation but because the story had become part of their collective identity. Community shock had evolved into community memory, a shared understanding that the town had once been tested and had endured. Meanwhile, the forgotten fingerprint that cracked the case became an emblem within law enforcement circles, cited in conferences and training seminars as proof that no piece of evidence is too small to matter. Delgado, now promoted, spoke about patience and preservation, about how a partial print lifted from a back door had survived decades of storage and administrative turnover. He described the moment the database returned a match as both triumphant and sobering because it underscored how close the truth had always been. Other agencies reopened their own cold cases with renewed determination, revisiting boxes of evidence long dismissed as unsolvable. In Millfield, the stories sparked conversations about trust and perception. Residents reflected on how easily Renshaw had blended into the fabric of their lives, how ordinary he had seemed. Some remembered lending him tools, chatting about weather, exchanging polite nods on sidewalks. The realization that he had carried a secret so dark for so long unsettled even those who had not known Carol personally. It challenged assumptions about safety in small towns, about the belief that danger announces itself with obvious signs. Parents spoke to their children about vigilance, about listening to instinct, about the importance of community awareness. Yet they also spoke about hope, about the fact that perseverance had ultimately prevailed. The Whitman house, once a symbol of unanswered questions, gradually became simply another residence, renovated and filled with new laughter. The current owners acknowledged its history, but refused to let it define their lives. They planted flowers along the walkway, repainting the door where the fingerprint had once been found, not to erase the past but to reclaim the present. Millfield's Main Street continued its rhythm of seasonal festivals and holiday parades, but there was a subtle shift in how the town viewed itself. It was no longer merely the site of a mysterious disappearance. It was a place that had confronted its shadows and illuminated them. The headline Illinois 1975 cold case solved. Forgotten fingerprint shocks. Small town remained archived in libraries and online databases, yet its impact persisted in quieter ways. High school students studying local history wrote essays about the case, analyzing how forensic science had evolved and how persistence can bridge decades. Teachers used the story to illustrate the importance of critical thinking and evidence preservation. The narrative transformed from tragedy into lesson, from fear into awareness. Still, on certain anniversaries, a hush seemed to settle over Maple Street. Longtime residents would recall the morning Carol vanished, the confusion and dread that followed, the years when hope flickered and dimmed. They would speak her name softly, ensuring it remained more than a headline. For them, justice had not erased the loss, but it had restored a measure of balance. Carol was no longer defined solely by absence. She was remembered for her life, her warmth, her aspirations. Investigators occasionally revisited the possibility that Renshaw had committed other crimes during his years of anonymity. Tips were evaluated, cross-referenced with unsolved cases in neighboring counties. None yielded definitive links, yet the effort reflected a commitment to thoroughness born from experience. The cold case that had once seemed isolated now served as a catalyst for broader scrutiny. Families from other unresolved investigations reached out to Millfield's authorities, seeking guidance, sharing stories, clinging to the possibility that their own forgotten evidence might one day speak. In this way, Carroll's case extended beyond town limits, influencing conversations about justice far beyond Illinois. Delgado often reflected on the fragile chain of events that led to the breakthrough: a preserved fingerprint, a digitization request, a database match entered years after the original crime. Had any link in that chain broken, the truth might have remained buried. That awareness instilled a sense of humility within the department, a recognition that solving a cold case is as much about stewardship as it is about discovery. Evidence rooms were reorganized, protocols updated, digital archives expanded. The past was treated not as a closed chapter, but as a reservoir of unfinished stories. For Carroll's surviving relatives, the years after the conviction brought a complicated piece. They visited the memorial plaque installed in the town square, tracing her name with their fingertips, imagining the life she might have lived had 1975 unfolded differently. They spoke publicly about resilience, about the importance of never surrendering to despair. Their voices carried both sorrow and strength, embodying the duality of justice achieved and life irretrievably altered. And as seasons continued their steady rotation, Millfield settled into a new equilibrium. The shock had softened, replaced by reflection. The mystery that once loomed over the town like a permanent storm cloud had dissipated, leaving behind lessons etched into collective memory. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved was no longer breaking news, but it remained a testament to endurance, to the idea that truth can outlast silence. On quiet evenings, when streetlights cast gentle pools of gold onto pavement, it is possible to imagine Carol walking home from school, papers tucked under her arm, unaware of the darkness that would interrupt her path. It is also possible to imagine the fingerprint on the door, invisible yet enduring, a silent witness waiting for the world to catch up. In that faint impression lies the story's enduring power, a reminder that even when time seems to conspire against resolution, persistence can carve a path through decades. Millfield carries that knowledge forward, not as a burden, but as a solemn promise that no story is ever truly finished until every trace has been heard, every fragment examined, and every silence given the chance to break. Decades after the verdict, when Thomas Renshaw's name had faded from national headlines and settled into the quiet permanence of prison records, the story of the Illinois 1975 cold case solved continued to echo in ways no one in Millfield had anticipated. Justice had been delivered in a courtroom, but its consequences rippled outward, reshaping memory, identity, and even the town's sense of time. The conviction had drawn a firm line beneath years of uncertainty, yet it also forced residents to confront how easily ordinary life can conceal extraordinary darkness. For those who had lived through the original disappearance, the passage of years felt distorted, as if 1975 and the present coexisted in uneasy parallel. They remembered the morning Carol Whitman vanished with startling clarity, the frost on lawns, the rumor spreading from one porch to the next, the realization that something irreversible had occurred. Now, with Renshaw aging behind bars, they grappled with a different question, one less dramatic but more persistent. What does a community do after the mystery ends? In the months following his incarceration, documentary crews and true crime authors descended briefly on Millfield, eager to capture the drama of a forgotten fingerprint resurrected by modern technology. Cameras lingered on Maple Street, on the courthouse steps, on the modest sheriff's office that had guarded the evidence for more than 3 decades. Residents participated cautiously, some eager to share their memories, others wary of reopening wounds. The spotlight eventually dimmed, but its glow left behind a subtle shift. Millfield was no longer anonymous. It was a place associated with resilience, with the idea that patience can outlast despair. Schools incorporated the case into local history lessons, not to sensationalize it, but to emphasize the importance of critical inquiry and community vigilance. Students who had never known Carol began to see her not merely as a tragic figure, but as a symbol of endurance, a reminder that truth may sleep, but does not die. Meanwhile, within the sheriff's department, the case became a benchmark. Younger deputies studied the investigation as part of their training, tracing the arc from 1975 to the digital age, examining how a single overlooked detail could alter destiny. Evidence rooms were treated with newfound reverence, every box catalogued meticulously, every fragment preserved with the awareness that it might one day speak. The forgotten fingerprint had transformed institutional culture, reinforcing the principle that nothing is insignificant. Beyond law enforcement, the town's social fabric subtly tightened. Neighbors checked in on one another more deliberately, aware that familiarity does not guarantee safety. Yet there was no descent into paranoia, no collective suspicion cast over newcomers. Instead, there emerged a quiet commitment to openness, to conversation, to ensuring that no voice of concern would be dismissed lightly again. For Carol's extended family, the years after the trial unfolded with a complex blend of relief and lingering sorrow. They had witnessed justice, yet they continued to search for traces of her presence in old photographs and preserved letters. Without a gravesite to visit, they created a ritual of remembrance in the town square, gathering each November to speak her name aloud. The memorial plaque installed after the conviction bore a simple inscription, honoring her life rather than the manner of her death. It became a focal point for reflection, a place where flowers appeared without announcement, where passers-by paused in quiet acknowledgement. Renshaw himself faded into obscurity, his appeals denied, his protests of innocence losing resonance with each passing year. Reporters occasionally sought comment from his attorneys, but the narrative had shifted decisively. The fingerprint match, corroborated by testimony and inconsistencies in his alibi, had cemented public perception. In prison, he became another aging inmate among many, his connection to Millfield reduced to a line in a case file. Yet for the town, his shadow lingered not as fear but as caution. Residents reflected on how easily they had accepted his presence decades earlier, how normal he had seemed. The lesson was not that strangers are inherently dangerous, but that vigilance must coexist with trust. As the digital era expanded, the Illinois 1975 cold case solved gained new life online. Podcasts dissected the timeline, forums debated the evidence, amateur sleuths revisited witness statements. Millfield watched from a distance, occasionally correcting misinformation, but largely allowing the broader world to engage with its history. There was a sense that the story belonged not only to the town but to anyone who believed in the persistence of truth. Delgado, now nearing retirement, often spoke about the case as both a professional milestone and a personal reminder. He described the moment the database returned a match not as triumph, but as responsibility, an obligation to pursue the lead with integrity and care. He acknowledged the fragility of old evidence, the danger of confirmation bias, the necessity of building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny. His reflections carried weight, shaping how future investigations were approached. Meanwhile, Millfield evolved in ordinary ways. New businesses opened on Main Street. Children who had marched in remembrance walks grew into adults starting families of their own. The Whitman House changed hands again, its history acknowledged in hushed tones but no longer dominating conversation. Life continued, layered with memory, but not defined by it. And yet, on certain quiet evenings, when autumn air sharpened and leaves rustled along Maple Street, the past seemed to brush gently against the present. Older residents would pause, recalling the unresolved years when hope had thinned and frustration had hardened into resignation. They would remember how the term cold case once felt like surrender, how it implied that answers were beyond reach. Now, that phrase carried a different meaning, a testament to endurance rather than defeat. The story's final resonance lay not solely in the conviction but in the transformation it inspired. It reinforced faith in institutions that can adapt and improve, in communities that can confront painful truths without fracturing, in the quiet power of a single preserved detail. Carol Whitman's life, interrupted so abruptly in 1975, became part of a broader narrative about patience and accountability. She was remembered not only as a victim of violence, but as the catalyst for change, the reason evidence rooms were modernized, the reason cold files were revisited with renewed determination. In that sense, her absence shaped the future as surely as her presence once shaped her classroom. As years accumulate and generations shift, the Illinois 1975 cold case solved remains woven into Millfield's identity, not as a scar, but as a solemn promise. It is the promise that silence will be challenged, that fragments will be preserved, that time itself can become an ally rather than an enemy. And in the stillness of a town that has known both mystery and resolution, there is a quiet understanding that justice, though delayed, can arrive with undeniable clarity, carried on something as fragile and enduring as the faint impression of a fingertip pressed against a door, waiting patiently across decades to be heard. Half a century after Carol Whitman stepped into the cold night air and vanished from Maple Street, the Illinois 1975 cold case solved no longer felt like breaking news, but like a chapter etched permanently into the identity of Millfield, a story told not with the urgency of shock, but with the gravity of memory. The town had aged, storefronts renovated, generations replaced, yet the echo of that November morning still lingered in subtle ways, in the way older residents paused before locking their doors, in the way the sheriff's department treated every unattended call with heightened attentiveness. Justice had been delivered in a courtroom years earlier, Thomas Renshaw condemned to spend the remainder of his life behind bars, but the emotional ledger of the crime had required far longer to balance. Carol's classmates were now grandparents, their recollections softened at the edges, yet vivid in feeling. They remembered her handwriting on chalkboards, the careful way she encouraged struggling students, the engagement ring she had shown with shy excitement days before she disappeared. For them, the conviction had brought relief, but it had also solidified the permanence of loss. There would be no miracle return, no dramatic revelation that she had survived elsewhere. The trial had closed the door on uncertainty and opened another on finality. Over time, Millfield's annual remembrance evolved from a vigil heavy with unanswered questions into a gathering centered on resilience. The memorial plaque in the town square became a site not only of mourning, but of education. High school history classes visited each year, teachers recounting how a forgotten fingerprint, preserved with quiet diligence, had bridged 3 decades of silence. Students listened with a mixture of fascination and disbelief that such a small fragment of evidence could endure longer than entire lifetimes. The story instilled a respect for detail, for the unseen threads that bind events across time. Within law enforcement circles, the Whitman case continued to serve as a cautionary and inspirational example. Evidence preservation protocols were refined repeatedly, each update tracing its philosophical roots back to that single smudged print lifted from a back door in 1975. Detectives from neighboring counties consulted Millfield's department when reopening their own cold cases, seeking guidance on balancing hope with realism. The phrase cold case gradually lost its implication of defeat and acquired a connotation of patience, a reminder that dormant does not mean dead. Delgado eventually retired, his career defined in part by the moment he chose to digitize an old file rather than discard it as unsolvable. In interviews conducted years later, he spoke not about personal triumph, but about collective responsibility, emphasizing that justice is rarely the result of one decision but of sustained stewardship across generations. His successor echoed that sentiment, ensuring that new recruits understood the Whitman investigation not as legend, but as lesson. Meanwhile, Renshaw aged in confinement, his appeals exhausted, his name invoked only in periodic updates about prison health or parole hearings that never advanced. He remained silent about Carol's final resting place, carrying that knowledge into the narrowing corridor of his remaining years. The absence of her remains continued to trouble her surviving relatives, yet they gradually accepted that some answers would remain beyond reach. They found solace in the conviction, in the certainty that the man responsible had been held accountable. They established a small scholarship in Carol's name for aspiring teachers, transforming tragedy into opportunity. Each year, a student from Millfield received support to pursue education, and in that quiet gesture, Carol's interrupted future extended forward through others. The Whitman house itself underwent another transformation, renovated into a modern home with wide windows and a bright porch light. The current owners acknowledged the history with respect, but refused to allow it to define their everyday lives. Children played in the yard, laughter drifting across the same patch of grass once cordoned with police tape. Life reclaimed the space not through denial, but through continuity. For longtime residents, that site carried profound symbolism. It affirmed that while violence can fracture a community, it cannot permanently suspend its growth. The broader cultural landscape also shifted. As true crime media expanded, the Illinois 1975 cold case solved found new audiences who dissected its timeline, debated its evidence, and marveled at the role of forensic evolution. Millfield observed this phenomenon with measured distance. The townspeople understood that for outsiders, the case was a narrative of suspense and resolution, but for them, it was lived experience, layered with personal memories and quiet grief. They welcomed attention when it emphasized perseverance and responsibility, and they recoiled when it veered toward sensationalism. Through it all, the central truth endured. A single preserved fingerprint had altered the trajectory of history. On the 50th anniversary of Carol's disappearance, Millfield held a larger commemoration than usual. The ceremony was neither somber nor celebratory, but reflective. Speakers recounted the arc from mysterious disappearance to community shock, from investigative deadlock to technological breakthrough. They spoke of the years when hope had thinned and of the moment when the database match reignited it. They honored not only Carol but also the investigators who refused to forget, the family members who endured uncertainty, and the townspeople who maintained faith in eventual answers. As dusk settled over the square, candles flickered against the autumn air, echoing the vigils of decades past but infused with a different emotion. There was sadness, yes, but also gratitude for clarity, however delayed. The narrative had shifted from haunting to testament. Carol Whitman was remembered not solely for the violence that ended her life, but for the impact her case had on shaping a culture of diligence and persistence. In quiet conversations afterward, older residents admitted that the conviction had altered their understanding of time. They had once believed that if justice did not arrive swiftly, it might never arrive at all. The Whitman case disproved that assumption, demonstrating that truth can outlast silence, that evidence can wait patiently for the tools capable of interpreting it. Younger generations absorbed that lesson with a different perspective, viewing the story as proof that technology and tenacity can converge to illuminate even the darkest corners of history. As night deepened and the crowd dispersed, Maple Street returned to its ordinary stillness. Porch lights glowed steadily, leaves rustled across sidewalks, and the town exhaled in collective remembrance. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved was no longer an active investigation, no longer a headline demanding attention, but it remained a quiet undercurrent shaping how Millfield understood itself. It served as a reminder that justice is not measured solely by speed but by certainty, not by spectacle but by persistence. And in that understanding lay the enduring legacy of a young teacher whose life was cut short, yet whose story compelled a community to hold fast to evidence, to hope, and to the belief that even the faintest impression left behind can carry the power to speak across generations. By the time the Illinois 1975 cold case solved past its 55th anniversary, Millfield had grown into a different town with wider roads, updated storefronts, and a generation that knew Carol Whitman only through photographs and carefully told stories, yet the case remained embedded in its civic DNA like a quiet code that influenced decisions long after the headlines had faded. The memory no longer arrived as a shockwave, but as a steady undercurrent, shaping how the community defined vigilance, responsibility, and trust. For those who had stood outside the Whitman house in 1975 watching deputies carry out boxes of evidence, the passage of time felt almost surreal. They had lived long enough to witness despair harden into a cold case, and then to see that cold case thaw under the steady pressure of science and persistence. Now, in their later years, they reflected on how close the truth had always been, resting in a partial fingerprint that survived not because of luck alone but because someone had chosen to preserve it. That realization carried weight beyond nostalgia. It reinforced a collective belief that details matter, that even in moments of chaos, care can alter the future. The sheriff's department had evolved into a modern facility with digital archives and climate-controlled evidence storage, and new recruits were taught the Whitman case, not as folklore but as foundational doctrine. They learned how a smudged impression on a back door, cataloged and sealed decades earlier, had ultimately exposed a man who believed time would shield him. The story was presented with restraint, emphasizing process over drama, yet its emotional resonance was impossible to ignore. Detectives who had not been born in 1975 felt connected to that moment through the chain of custody forms, the original photographs, the careful handwriting of officers long retired or deceased. It was a reminder that law enforcement is a relay across generations, each participant carrying fragments of unfinished work. Beyond the department walls, the case influenced civic culture in quieter ways. Millfield invested in neighborhood programs that encouraged communication and awareness, not out of fear but out of commitment to shared responsibility. The lesson residents drew from the tragedy was not suspicion of one another, but attentiveness to one another. Community meetings often referenced the importance of speaking up when something felt wrong, recalling how in 1975 small observations had gone unconnected because no single detail seemed decisive. The Whitman Scholarship, established years earlier, continued to support aspiring teachers, and each recipient learned about the woman whose name funded their education. In classrooms across the region, educators used the case to discuss the evolution of forensic science, illustrating how advancements in database technology and evidence analysis transformed what once appeared unsolvable. Students were often startled to learn that for decades the key to resolution had sat quietly in storage, waiting for innovation to catch up. The narrative fostered respect for both patience and progress, a dual appreciation rarely captured in dramatic retellings. Meanwhile, Thomas Renshaw's life narrowed within prison walls, his health declining, his world reduced to routine and memory. He remained silent about the precise details of Carol's final moments, a silence that frustrated investigators who still hoped for a disclosure that might lead to her remains. As years accumulated, it became increasingly clear that such a confession might never arrive. For Carol's surviving relatives, now spread across states and generations, acceptance took a different form. They focused less on what remained unknown and more on what had been affirmed, that the man responsible had been identified and judged. They gathered occasionally in Millfield, standing before the memorial plaque, tracing the engraved letters as if reaffirming a promise. The town's relationship with the case matured as well. True crime media continued to revisit it periodically, drawn by the dramatic arc from mysterious disappearance to shocking fingerprint match, but Millfield responded with measured calm. Residents understood that for audiences elsewhere the story carried elements of suspense and revelation, yet for them it represented lived endurance. They participated in interviews selectively, emphasizing the importance of evidence preservation rather than sensational details. Over time, the case became less about the perpetrator and more about the process that uncovered him. Delgado, now fully retired, returned occasionally for commemorative events, his presence greeted with quiet respect rather than celebrity. He often spoke about humility and investigation, about the thin line between resolution and oblivion, about how easily the fingerprint could have been misplaced or degraded. His reflections resonated deeply with younger officers who recognized that their own work might one day depend on similar foresight. As the town marked 60 years since Carol's disappearance, the commemoration felt less like reopening a wound and more like acknowledging a legacy. The ceremony included not only speeches about the past but presentations from forensic experts demonstrating how technology continued to evolve. It was a subtle declaration that Millfield would never again allow evidence to languish without possibility. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved had become both cautionary tale and beacon, illustrating that justice delayed need not mean justice denied. On Maple Street, life unfolded with ordinary rhythms. Children rode bicycles past the renovated Whitman house, unaware of the precise location where a fingerprint had once altered history. Their parents, however, carried that knowledge quietly, an invisible inheritance. They locked doors at night not out of paranoia but habit, and they taught their children that community is built not only on trust but on attentiveness. The memory of Carol Whitman existed in layers, from personal recollection to civic lesson, from tragedy to transformation. As dusk settled over Millfield on another anniversary, porch lights illuminated tidy lawns, and the air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. The town no longer felt haunted, yet it remained mindful. The cold case that once defined it had evolved into a story of endurance, of a fragment preserved across decades, of a truth that waited patiently for recognition. In that waiting lay the deepest lesson, that time, often perceived as an adversary in matters of justice, can also be an ally when evidence is safeguarded and determination endures. And so Millfield moved forward, not forgetting but integrating, carrying within its quiet streets the knowledge that even the faintest trace left behind can one day speak with undeniable clarity, reshaping history and reminding all who listen that persistence is sometimes the most powerful force of all. 70 years after that frozen November morning in 1975, when Carol Whitman stepped into the darkness and never returned, Millfield stood as a town transformed not by tragedy alone but by the long arc of accountability that followed. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved no longer a headline shouted in disbelief, but a quiet foundation beneath the community's understanding of justice. The people who had been young adults when she vanished were now memories themselves, their stories passed down like heirlooms, their voices echoing through grandchildren who learned about the mysterious disappearance as part of local heritage rather than breaking news. Time had layered perspective over pain, yet it had not erased the imprint of that absence. The Whitman case became less about shock and more about stewardship, less about fear and more about vigilance sustained across generations. In the sheriff's department, now equipped with advanced digital mapping tools and forensic software unimaginable in 1975, new cadets studied the case during orientation, tracing how a single partial fingerprint, lifted from the inside of a back door, endured in a sealed envelope until technology matured enough to decode its message. They were taught that evidence is not inert, that it possesses potential energy waiting for the right moment to release. The phrase cold case carried no stigma within those walls. It represented an obligation rather than a defeat. Officers spoke with respect about the chain of custody that preserved the print, about the detective who chose to re-examine it decades later, about the database alert that illuminated a name long separated from the crime. They recognized that their own work might one day serve investigators, not yet born. Beyond the institutional memory, Millfield's civic life absorbed the lessons of the past into everyday rituals. Community gatherings emphasized connection, open dialogue, and attentiveness to subtle signs. Parents who had once whispered anxiously about the case now framed it differently for their children, describing not only the violence, but the perseverance that followed. They explained how justice can move slowly yet decisively, how patience can coexist with urgency. The Whitman Scholarship had grown into a modest foundation supporting multiple students each year, ensuring that Carol's interrupted vocation as a teacher continued through others. Recipients often visited the memorial plaque before departing for college, tracing the engraved letters and reflecting on how a life cut short could still influence futures decades later. Meanwhile, Thomas Renshaw's chapter closed quietly when news emerged of his death within prison walls, a brief notice in regional papers that stirred minimal public reaction. There was no dramatic confession, no late revelation of hidden details. His silence accompanied him to the end, leaving certain questions permanently unresolved. For Carol's descendants and distant relatives, the announcement produced neither triumph nor renewed anguish, only a solemn acknowledgement that the man responsible would never again occupy their horizon. The legal accountability had long been established. His passing merely sealed the final procedural door. What remained was the enduring impact of the case itself. Over time, scholars examining the evolution of forensic databases cited the Illinois 1975 cold case solved as an early example of how preserved physical evidence could bridge generational gaps. Law schools referenced it when discussing the balance between circumstantial proof and technological certainty. Journalism students analyzed the media coverage, noting how narratives shifted from mysterious disappearance to community shock to eventual resolution, reflecting broader cultural attitudes toward crime and memory. Millfield found itself woven into academic discourse, a small town influencing larger conversations about justice and time. Yet daily life continued with familiar rhythms. The Whitman house, renovated repeatedly over decades, stood indistinguishable from its neighbors, its history invisible to passers-by, unless they paused to remember. Children played beneath trees that had not yet been planted in 1975, their laughter unburdened by the past. Elderly residents occasionally shared recollections on front porches, describing the tension of the early investigation, the despair of unanswered years, the disbelief when the fingerprint match surfaced. Their stories carried a cadence shaped by distance, the edges of fear softened but not erased. Each retelling reaffirmed a communal identity built on endurance. The annual commemoration evolved into a broader celebration of civic responsibility, featuring workshops on evidence preservation, guest lectures from forensic experts, and panels discussing unsolved cases nationwide. It was less about revisiting trauma and more about reinforcing commitment. Attendees understood that the most profound tribute to Carol Whitman was not perpetual mourning, but sustained vigilance. As technology advanced further, including sophisticated genetic genealogy tools and expanded biometric databases, Millfield's law enforcement remained attentive to emerging possibilities, occasionally revisiting unsolved files with renewed optimism. The Whitman case served as both reminder and catalyst, proof that time need not be an adversary when diligence persists. For younger generations, the narrative inspired curiosity rather than dread. They viewed it as a testament to progress, an illustration of how science and determination intersect. Some pursued careers in criminal justice or forensic science, citing the case as early influence. Others simply absorbed its moral architecture, the idea that truth can endure obscurity. As the town approached the centennial of Carol's birth, plans emerged for a more expansive memorial event, one that would integrate art installations, educational exhibits, and community storytelling sessions. Organizers sought to honor not only the victim but the collective journey from uncertainty to resolution. They emphasized themes of patience, responsibility, and intergenerational continuity. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved had matured into a parable about time itself, about how decades can conceal yet also reveal, about how the faintest trace preserved in evidence can outlast memory. On a crisp autumn evening, nearly 75 years after her disappearance, residents gathered once more in the town square. The sky mirrored the pale chill of that original November morning, yet the atmosphere felt markedly different. There was no frantic search, no rumor swirling unchecked, no dread of the unknown. Instead, there was reflection, gratitude for answers hard-won, acknowledgement of loss without surrender to despair. Speakers recounted the arc of the investigation, from initial confusion to technological breakthrough, from community shock to enduring lesson. They spoke of the fingerprint as if it were both artifact and metaphor, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, traces of truth persist. As candles flickered against the evening air, illuminating faces young and old, Millfield seemed to stand not in the shadow of tragedy, but in the light of understanding. The story that began as a mysterious disappearance had transformed into a narrative of accountability and perseverance. And in the steady glow of porch lights lining Maple Street, there remained a quiet assurance that the town would carry forward what it had learned, that justice may require decades, that silence can be broken by diligence, and that even the smallest fragment left behind can one day speak with a clarity strong enough to reshape history and anchor a community in the enduring belief that truth, however patient, ultimately finds its voice. Nearly 80 years after Carol Whitman disappeared into the freezing dark of a 1975 Illinois night, the phrase Illinois 1975 cold case solved carried the weight of history rather than urgency, a reminder etched into Millfield's collective consciousness that truth can lie dormant longer than a lifetime and still emerge with undeniable force. The town that once trembled under the strain of a mysterious disappearance had become a place defined not by fear but by endurance, its identity shaped by the slow, methodical pursuit of answers that outlasted doubt, rumor, and even the memory of those who first searched the fields and ponds for a missing young teacher. The generation that had organized candlelight vigils in the immediate aftermath was now gone, their recollections preserved in recordings, local archives, and the steady cadence of stories retold at family gatherings. Younger residents grew up understanding the case not as an open wound but as a testament, a living example of how evidence, once safeguarded, can transcend decades of silence. In the modern sheriff's headquarters, a glass display case near the entrance held a replica of the envelope that once contained the partial fingerprint lifted from the Whitman back door. The original remained secured in climate-controlled storage, but the replica served as a quiet symbol for visitors and new recruits alike. Beneath it, a simple inscription explained how a single preserved detail bridged the gap between 1975 and the digital age, connecting a vanished woman to a man who believed time would shield him. Cadets paused before it during orientation, absorbing the lesson that their routine tasks might one day determine whether justice is delayed or denied. The story had become institutional memory, a thread woven through every policy update and technological upgrade. Beyond law enforcement, Millfield's civic life carried echoes of that long-ago November. Community forums emphasized transparency and communication, rooted in the understanding that fragmented information can stall investigations while shared vigilance can propel them forward. Parents spoke to children about the importance of awareness without instilling fear, drawing from the town's own history to illustrate how trust and attentiveness must coexist. The Whitman Scholarship Foundation had expanded into a regional initiative supporting educators across several counties, its mission statement reflecting both Carol's vocation and the broader principle that loss can inspire constructive legacy. Each scholarship ceremony included a brief recounting of the case, not as spectacle, but as reminder of resilience. Decades earlier, when the fingerprint match first surfaced in a national database, it had triggered community shock and renewed media frenzy. Now, in the era of advanced biometric systems and predictive analytics, the case was studied as an early milestone in the maturation of forensic science. Universities invited Millfield officials to speak about the preservation chain that safeguarded the evidence across administrative transitions, budget constraints, and technological shifts. Scholars analyzing cold case methodologies cited the Whitman investigation as proof that meticulous record-keeping can become the hinge upon which history turns. The phrase cold case itself evolved linguistically within Millfield, shedding its connotation of abandonment and acquiring one of suspended potential. Residents understood that unresolved did not mean forgotten. Meanwhile, the physical landscape of the town bore little resemblance to the one Carol knew. New housing developments bordered the outskirts, roads widened, and the once modest main street featured modern storefronts alongside preserved historic facades. Yet Maple Street retained a certain quiet continuity, its trees older and broader, its sidewalks worn smooth by generations. The Whitman House, renovated and expanded over time, blended seamlessly into the neighborhood. Visitors would never guess that it once stood at the epicenter of a mystery that gripped the region. For longtime residents, that ordinariness held profound symbolism. It affirmed that tragedy, while transformative, need not permanently define a place. On milestone anniversaries, Millfield's commemorations emphasized education and reflection rather than mourning. Panels featured forensic experts discussing advances that might unlock other dormant investigations nationwide. High school students presented research projects analyzing how technological innovation intersects with legal standards. The narrative arc from disappearance to conviction to legacy became a case study in persistence. Carol Whitman's name resonated not as a symbol of fear, but as catalyst for reform and progress. Her relatives, now spanning multiple generations, attended these events with measured pride. They acknowledged the enduring sorrow of an unmarked gravesite, yet expressed gratitude that accountability had been achieved within their lifetimes. The death of Thomas Renshaw years earlier had closed the final chapter of direct confrontation, leaving behind a record of conviction that required no further defense. His silence regarding the location of Carol's remains remained a lingering absence, but it no longer dominated discourse. Instead, attention centered on the broader impact of the case, on how a small town's determination influenced practices beyond its borders. True crime enthusiasts continued to rediscover the story through documentaries and digital archives, intrigued by the dramatic pivot from forgotten fingerprint to courtroom verdict. Millfield participated selectively, careful to steer narratives toward lessons rather than sensationalism. Residents were protective of the distinction between remembrance and exploitation. They insisted that the essence of the story lay not in the violence itself, but in the endurance that followed. As the 80th anniversary of Carol's disappearance approached, preparations for a commemorative symposium began months in advance. The event aimed to gather investigators, educators, students, and community members to reflect on the evolution of cold case investigations over nearly a century. Presentations would trace the journey from inked fingerprint cards to instantaneous digital matches, from paper files stored in metal cabinets to cloud-based archival systems. At the center of every discussion remained the simple truth that preservation and patience had converged at the right moment. On the evening of the symposium, the town square filled once more, illuminated not by urgency, but by quiet conviction. Speakers recounted the timeline in measured tones, emphasizing the human cost alongside the institutional lessons. They spoke of Carol's aspirations as a teacher, her engagement plans, the life interrupted before it fully unfolded. They spoke of the officers who refused to discard evidence, of the detective who chose to revisit a dusty file, of the database entry that connected past to present. The crowd listened not in shock, but in recognition of shared inheritance. The Illinois 1975 cold case solved had transcended its initial narrative, becoming an enduring testament to the interplay between time, technology, and tenacity. As night settled over Millfield and porch lights flickered along Maple Street, there was a sense not of closure alone, but of continuity. The town understood that future challenges would arise, that new mysteries might test its resolve. Yet it carried forward a hard-earned certainty that even when years accumulate and memories fade, truth can persist in the smallest preserved detail, waiting for the moment when determination and innovation align. And in that certainty, Millfield found its enduring strength, rooted not in the absence of darkness, but in the unwavering belief that no fragment of evidence is ever truly silent, and no story is beyond the reach of patient, relentless pursuit. The courtroom in rural Illinois felt smaller than ever as the final exhibit was lifted into the light, a brittle card sealed in plastic, a forgotten fingerprint pulled from dust and silence, the single mark that had slept for nearly half a century, while a town whispered about ghosts. In 1975, headlines screamed cold case, brutal slaying, community in shock, and then the noise faded, replaced by routine and resignation, until this print, preserved like a time capsule, shattered the calm and forced everyone to look backward at the night that refused to die. Back then, the victim was a young store clerk closing up under flickering fluorescent lights, a routine Friday in a town where doors were rarely locked and everyone knew the sound of every passing truck. When she failed to return home, panic moved faster than police radios, and by dawn the discovery inside the shop turned Main Street into a crime scene sealed with yellow tape and disbelief. Investigators documented overturned shelves, a silent register, and one partial print on a glass counter, smudged yet stubborn, the only physical whisper left behind by whoever walked out into darkness. The town gathered at vigils, newspapers printed grainy photographs, and detectives chased tips that unraveled into nothing. Suspicions circled drifters, former boyfriends, out-of-state travelers passing through on highways that cut across cornfields like scars. Interviews stretched late into the night. Alibis were checked and rechecked, polygraphs administered in cramped rooms heavy with cigarette smoke. Yet the fingerprint refused to match anyone in local files, and without a national system robust enough to compare across states, it became a relic of frustration, sealed in an envelope and filed away as leads dried up. Years rolled forward. Children grew into parents, and the case became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to teenagers lingering too long after dark. The original detectives retired, some carrying quiet guilt that they had not delivered justice, others convinced the truth would surface eventually. The evidence box moved from shelf to shelf as departments modernized, paper reports yellowing, photographs curling at the edges. But the fingerprint remained intact, an accidental act of preservation that would outlast careers, marriages, and even the building where the crime first unfolded. In the early 2000s, as technology surged and databases expanded, a new generation of investigators reopened cold cases with cautious optimism. They digitized reports, scanned photographs, and fed old prints into evolving systems that could search nationwide in seconds. The Illinois case resurfaced not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, but because someone believed the forgotten mark deserved another chance. The print was carefully reprocessed, enhanced with modern imaging, its ridges clarified like a map emerging from fog, and then submitted into a network that spanned all 50 states. Weeks passed with no immediate hit, reinforcing the familiar sting of disappointment. Yet behind the scenes, algorithms compared loops and whirls against millions of records, including those added decades after the murder. Then, quietly, a notification appeared, a potential match linked to an arrest in another state years after the 1975 killing. The name attached to that record belonged to a man who had once lived only miles from the victim, a former delivery driver who moved away shortly after the crime, leaving behind little more than vague memories. Detectives revisited old yearbooks, employment records, and faded witness statements, realizing the man had been questioned briefly in the original investigation but released when nothing tied him to the scene. Back then, his prints were never compared to the smudge on the counter because they were not on file, and there was no reason strong enough to compel deeper scrutiny. Now, decades later, his fingerprints from a later arrest aligned with the preserved mark in Illinois, ridge for ridge, a silent testimony carried across time by science. The revelation rippled through the small town like an aftershock. People who had grown accustomed to the mystery felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. Some remembered the suspect as quiet, others as polite, a man who blended into church picnics and hardware store lines without drawing attention. The idea that he might have walked among them after the crime, shaking hands, exchanging small talk, unsettled those who believed evil always announces itself loudly. Instead, it had apparently worn an ordinary face and waited decades to be unmasked. Authorities moved cautiously, aware that a single database hit was only the beginning. They re-examined the physical evidence, consulted forensic experts, and sought to confirm the match through rigorous comparison. Each step was documented meticulously, anticipating defense challenges and the scrutiny of a public that had waited nearly 50 years. When the confirmation arrived, unequivocal and supported by multiple analysts, the case that once seemed destined for eternal limbo suddenly had a living suspect, an aging man unaware that his past was closing in. Arresting him required coordination across state lines, a quiet operation designed to prevent flight or public spectacle. Officers approached his modest home in the early morning, the same hour when the victim had once prepared for work, and informed him of the warrant tied to a crime from 1975. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, stunned as handcuffs clicked around wrists that had long ago been dismissed from suspicion. The charge was murder, the evidence a fingerprint that had waited patiently through nearly half a century of silence. Interrogators faced a suspect no longer young, a man whose hair had turned gray and whose memories were filtered through decades of distance. He denied involvement, expressed confusion, even indignation, insisting that any presence at the store had been innocent and long forgotten. Yet prosecutors emphasized that fingerprints do not fabricate stories, that science does not age or forget. The courtroom became the stage where past and present collided, where black and white photographs met digital displays projecting enlarged ridges that seemed almost abstract until jurors understood their meaning. Family members of the victim sat in the front row, carrying photographs of the young woman whose life ended before many jurors were born. They had endured years of anniversaries marked by unanswered questions, birthdays shadowed by absence, and holidays tinged with unresolved grief. The fingerprint, once an emblem of failure, now represented hope that accountability was still possible. As expert witnesses explained the evolution of forensic databases and the reliability of the match, the narrative of the case shifted from mystery to reckoning. Defense attorneys argued about contamination, about the handling of evidence across decades, about the reliability of systems that did not exist in 1975. They questioned chain of custody, highlighted gaps in documentation, and urged jurors to consider the frailty of memory and the passage of time. But the prosecution returned repeatedly to the same point. The print found on the glass counter was left by the person who touched it during the crime, and it matched the defendant with overwhelming certainty. The courtroom listened, weighing science against doubt. When the verdict finally arrived, it carried the weight of half a century. Guilty, the foreperson declared, and a collective breath seemed to leave the room. The once unsolved Illinois cold case, the mystery that had lingered like a stubborn storm cloud, now had a name officially tied to it. Outside the courthouse, reporters described the moment as historic, a testament to perseverance and technological progress. Inside, the victim's family embraced quietly, their relief complicated by the knowledge that justice delayed can never restore lost years. Yet even with a conviction, the story refuses to feel simple. The town must reconcile its memories with a new reality, re-examining old conversations and fleeting encounters through a darker lens. The fingerprint that shocked a small community did more than identify a suspect. It reopened wounds, challenged assumptions, and proved that time does not erase truth. It merely buries it until someone is willing to dig. And as night falls again over the same Illinois streets, the echo of 1975 lingers, a reminder that some cases never truly sleep. The final chapter of this Illinois saga does not begin with celebration, but with a question that refuses to fade. How could a single fingerprint lie dormant for nearly 50 years while a killer lived an ordinary life beneath open skies and church steeples? The answer is not simple, and the truth is not gentle. In 1975, when panic first gripped the town and squad cars lined the quiet streets, no one imagined that justice would depend on technology not yet invented, on databases not yet built, on a future generation willing to reopen a box coated in dust and disappointment. Back then, the crime scene felt immediate and raw, a shattered sense of safety in a place where people still left keys in their ignitions. Detectives worked with what they had: film cameras, handwritten notes, fingerprint cards compared manually against limited files. The smudged print on the glass counter was treated carefully, cataloged, stored, but it had nowhere to go. It was a voice without a microphone, evidence without an audience. As the decades rolled forward, the case transformed into legend. Teenagers heard about it from parents who spoke in lowered tones. The store where it happened changed ownership, then purpose, then facade, as if fresh paint could bury memory. But anniversaries arrived each year like clockwork, bringing renewed headlines, brief interviews with aging relatives, and the same unanswered questions. Cold case. Mysterious slaying. Community still waiting. The language hardened into ritual, a pattern repeated so often that some began to believe resolution would never come. Meanwhile, the man who would one day stand convicted built a life elsewhere, worked jobs, paid bills, blended into neighborhoods far from Illinois. If he felt fear, he hid it well. If he believed he had escaped scrutiny, time seemed to prove him right. The breakthrough did not arrive with sirens or dramatic confessions. It arrived through patience. A new detective, reviewing unsolved files as part of a statewide initiative, Notice the preserved fingerprint and the lack of a modern database search. Advances in forensic science had quietly reshaped criminal investigations across America, and what was impossible in 1975 had become routine decades later. The print was scanned with high-resolution imaging, every ridge clarified, every whorl sharpened. It was uploaded into a national system capable of comparing it against millions of records in seconds. This was not guesswork, not intuition, but mathematics and pattern recognition operating at a scale the original investigators could scarcely imagine. When the match alert appeared, it felt almost unreal. A name surfaced, tied to an arrest years after the murder for an unrelated offense. That arrest had required fingerprinting, and those prints had entered the national system. Suddenly, the forgotten mark from Illinois had a counterpart. Detectives verified the hit with independent analysts, repeating comparisons, ensuring no error could contaminate what might be their only chance. The alignment was undeniable. Ridge endings matched. Bifurcations corresponded. The probability of coincidence shrank to near zero. A ghost from 1975 had been identified not by memory or rumor, but by science. The arrest decades later was subdued yet seismic. Neighbors in the suspect's current communities struggled to reconcile the charges with the man they thought they knew. He had aged, slowed, adapted to modern life. But the warrant linked him directly to that long-ago night in Illinois when a young woman never came home. Investigators reconstructed his movements from archived employment records and witness statements, placing him within reach of the crime scene. He had once delivered goods near the store. He had once been questioned briefly, then dismissed when no immediate evidence surfaced. Back then, the absence of a fingerprint record shielded him. Now, that absence had evaporated. In court, prosecutors laid out a timeline that spanned nearly half a century. They described the original investigation, the limitations of the era, and the preservation of evidence that made a future match possible. Jurors listened as experts explained how fingerprint analysis had evolved, how digital systems reduced human error and expanded comparison capabilities nationwide. The defense challenged the chain of custody, questioned the reliability of old evidence, and emphasized the years that had passed. They argued that memories fade, that contamination is possible, that doubt still exists. But the fingerprint itself remained constant, a physical trace left in 1975 and verified in the present. The victim's family endured the proceedings with visible restraint. For them, the trial was not about technological triumph, but about a life interrupted. They remembered her laughter, her plans, her small routines. They remembered the night they waited for her return and the morning that shattered everything. Over decades, they had navigated grief without answers, constructing lives around absence. The courtroom finally offered clarity, though it could not restore what was lost. When the jury delivered a guilty verdict, the words echoed far beyond the walls, traveling back through years of uncertainty and settling over a town that had nearly given up hope. Sentencing brought another wave of emotion. The defendant, now elderly, faced punishment long delayed. Some in the community debated whether justice so late could truly be called justice. Others insisted that accountability has no expiration date. The judge acknowledged the extraordinary span of time between crime and conviction, emphasizing the resilience of evidence and the perseverance of those who refused to let the case die. Outside, cameras captured reactions, reporters revisited archival footage, and headlines proclaimed the end of a 1975 cold case. Yet for many residents, the story did not feel like an ending but a reckoning. The fingerprint that once symbolized frustration had become the linchpin of resolution. It demonstrated how advancements in forensic science can breathe life into forgotten files, how diligence in preserving evidence can transcend generations. It also exposed the fragility of certainty. For decades, theories had circulated, suspicions had shifted, and rumors had flourished. The truth, when it emerged, was both simpler and more unsettling than speculation. It was not an unknown drifter passing through. It was not an elaborate conspiracy. It was a man who had stood within reach of scrutiny and walked away because the tools of the time were insufficient. Today, the town carries a different narrative. The case is no longer defined solely by tragedy, but by persistence. Schools discuss it in the context of forensic progress. Local officials cite it as proof that no file is ever truly closed. Yet beneath that renewed sense of closure lies a quiet understanding that justice, delayed, extracts its own cost. The victim did not live to see her name cleared of mystery. Her family spent decades in limbo. Detectives who first worked the scene did not witness the resolution they once sought. Time moved relentlessly forward, indifferent to unfinished business. And still, as evening settles over the same Illinois streets where the story began, there is a lingering chill. Not because the case remains unsolved, but because it reminds everyone how easily normalcy can mask darkness, how long silence can endure, how a single overlooked detail can determine the course of justice. The fingerprint shocks not only because it identified a killer, but because it reveals the thin line between certainty and ignorance. In 1975, the town believed it had reached a dead end. In reality, the answer was already there, pressed into glass, waiting for a future that could finally understand it. Nearly half a century after that violent night in 1975, when flashing lights first stained the quiet streets of small-town Illinois red and blue, the story still refuses to rest quietly, because even with a conviction secured and a name etched into court records, the echoes of that cold case linger like a low, relentless hum beneath everyday life. Back then, the headlines were sharp and urgent: brutal murder, young clerk slain, community in fear, and neighbors who had once trusted the stillness of their town suddenly locked their doors and watched strangers with suspicion. The crime scene had been frozen in time, a modest storefront turned into a chamber of unanswered questions, and among the scattered items and overturned displays lay the single, stubborn clue that would outlive detectives, mayors, and even the building itself: a partial fingerprint left on a glass counter, faint yet undeniable, a silent witness that refused to speak for decades. In those early days, investigators worked tirelessly, chasing leads that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. They questioned coworkers, former classmates, passing truck drivers, anyone who might have crossed paths with the victim in the hours before her death. The town gathered at vigils, candles flickering in trembling hands, grief transforming into resolve. But resolve could not manufacture evidence, and suspicion could not replace proof. The fingerprint, carefully lifted and sealed, had no match in local or state files. Without a comprehensive national system, it was like shouting into a void. The case slowly cooled, then chilled, and eventually solidified into the category every detective dreads: unsolved. Years turned into decades, and the tragedy embedded itself into the identity of the town. Parents referenced it when warning teenagers about late nights. New residents learned of it as part of local lore, the story everyone knew, but no one could finish. Meanwhile, technological revolutions transformed the world beyond those cornfields. Computers shrank from room-sized machines to handheld devices. Databases expanded from filing cabinets to global networks. And quietly, methodically, forensic science advanced, building the very tools that might one day unlock the mystery sealed in that evidence box. When a new generation of investigators reopened the case, it was not driven by a sudden tip or dramatic confession, but by persistence and possibility. The fingerprint was scanned using high-resolution imaging, revealing intricate ridge patterns that earlier techniques could not fully capture. Enhanced and clarified, the image was entered into a national database capable of comparing it against millions of prints collected from arrests across the country. The process was clinical, almost routine, yet beneath the surface pulsed a fragile hope that this time, the silent witness would finally find its voice. The match, when it came, did not arrive with fireworks. It appeared as a digital alert, a potential identification linked to a man whose fingerprints had been recorded years after the 1975 crime during an unrelated arrest. That record had placed his prints into the national system, unknowingly connecting him to a crime he may have believed buried forever. Detectives confirmed the match through meticulous comparison, multiple analysts independently verifying the alignment of ridge endings and bifurcations. Science left little room for doubt. The fingerprint from the Illinois storefront and the one in the modern database belonged to the same individual. The revelation sent shockwaves through two communities: the Illinois town that had waited nearly 50 years for answers, and the suspect's current neighborhood, where he had lived a seemingly ordinary life. Friends described him as quiet, neighbors as unremarkable. No one imagined that behind the familiar routines lay an accusation tied to a brutal crime from another era. When officers arrived to make the arrest, it was early morning, the kind of hour when most people are still wrapped in sleep and routine feels safest. The handcuffs clicked, and the past surged forward with unstoppable force. Back in Illinois, reporters revisited archived footage and yellowed newspaper clippings. The victim's photograph reappeared on television screens, her youthful face preserved in black and white. For her family, the arrest reopened wounds that had never fully healed. They had spent decades navigating grief without closure, marking birthdays and anniversaries with a lingering question: who did this and why? Now, at last, there was a name, a suspect, a chance for accountability. But the years that had passed could not be reclaimed, and justice delayed carries its own quiet ache. The trial became a collision between 1975 and the present. Prosecutors outlined the original investigation, the limitations of technology at the time, and the careful preservation of evidence that made a future breakthrough possible. Forensic experts explained how modern databases function, how algorithms compare prints across jurisdictions in seconds, how accuracy has improved beyond what detectives in the 70s could imagine. The defense challenged the reliability of decades-old evidence, raising questions about chain of custody and the possibility of contamination. They emphasized the gap in time, arguing that memory fades and certainty erodes. Yet the fingerprint remained constant, immune to the passage of years. It did not rely on recollection or interpretation. It was a physical imprint left at the scene. Jurors studied enlarged images projected onto screens, tracing the loops and arches that connected the defendant to the counter where the victim had once stood. The courtroom was silent as experts testified to the improbability of coincidence. The science was precise, the methodology transparent, the conclusion stark. When the verdict was announced, guilty, it felt less like a dramatic climax and more like the final turn of a key long rusted in place. The victim's family wept quietly, their relief tempered by the knowledge that nearly half a century had passed since that devastating night. The defendant, now aged and visibly diminished, faced sentencing for a crime committed in youth. The judge spoke of accountability without expiration, of the enduring power of evidence, of the responsibility to pursue truth regardless of time. In the aftermath, the town grappled with complex emotions. There was validation that the system had not forgotten, that perseverance and technology together had delivered answers. But there was also introspection. How many conversations had occurred over the years? How many encounters with the man now convicted, without anyone suspecting the truth? The case forced residents to confront the unsettling reality that evil can wear an ordinary face, that normalcy can coexist with darkness for decades. Today, the storefront where the crime occurred has long since changed hands, its walls repainted, its purpose redefined. Yet the memory endures, woven into local history. The fingerprint that once symbolized failure now stands as proof of resilience, a testament to the importance of preserving evidence and refusing to abandon unanswered questions. It is a reminder that cold cases are not always dead ends but paused narratives, waiting for the right tools and the right moment. As night settles again over the same Illinois streets, the air feels different, not because the past has been erased, but because it has been acknowledged. The case that haunted generations has finally been named and judged. Still, the story lingers in the collective consciousness, a cautionary tale about time, justice, and the fragile illusion of safety. The forgotten fingerprint shocked a small town not only by identifying a killer, but by revealing how close the truth had always been, pressed silently into glass, waiting for a future bold enough and advanced enough to bring it into the light.